The Psych Sessions podcast is now sponsored by STP. That's the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's APA Division 2 or our teaching tribe. Just a couple things from STP this week. STP members will soon receive ballots to vote for President-elect, Secretary, 2 Vice Presidents, and STP's representative to APA Council. Candidate statements appear on the STP website at teachpsych.org. Please vote. And the deadline for proposals for STP's annual conference on teaching has been extended to May 1st. ACT will be held on October 8th through 10th in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Thanks.
Hello, and welcome to Psych Sessions, conversations about teaching and stuff. I'm Eric Landrum, along with Garth Neufeld, your podcast hosts. As the name implies, we center on conversations about teaching, but we often veer into other interesting topics, which is the end stuff. This is episode number 90, where Garth had the opportunity to interview Pooja Agarwal from Berklee College of Music in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, before you hear the interview, please allow me to share some listening tips and some of my favorite moments. Now, I had a chance to meet Pooja for the very first time the night before the conference began. I was hanging out in the lobby, getting ready to go to dinner, and we were getting ready to head out, and she was coming in. And it was delightful to meet her in person. We'd never met before. And there's an instant likability and a connection. And I was so pleased to get to meet her in person. And a conference you're racing around, you never have time for the conversations that you want to have. And it made me think and reflect as I was listening to her interview now, getting ready to record these prefatory notes, that I'm so thankful that she and Garth found the time to record this interview at the conclusion of ACT. It's just a benefit that we all have. When you meet someone so genuine and so learned that they take time to share that with us. And so I'm really thankful for both of them to making that extra effort. It also reminds me that there once was a time before COVID-19 that we got to gather together in, large groups of people and share each other's stewardship, fellowship, and company together. And I look forward to those times again as soon as safely possible. So back to Pooja and her talk and her knowledge and expertise that she shared with us. I do like when she talks in the interview about, there is this dichotomy oftentimes when we talk about the research in K-12 and higher ed and how there may be a false dichotomy there. And I like that she opened with that. She and Garth spent quite a bit of time talking about the concepts related to her book that's co-authored with Patrice Bain, Powerful Teaching, Unleash the Science of Learning. And this actually comes out of a collaboration that the two of them had over a 15-year period. And some of you may think, oh my gosh, they spent too much time talking about this book. So a couple things. First off, it makes great sense to talk about this book because these are ideas that teachers of psychology and others can apply directly to help their students become better learners. And secondly, if you're a regular listener to the podcast, whenever we have authors on, we always want them to talk about their books. We believe that our listeners are interested in hearing textbook authors, whether it's intro psych or a book like Powerful Teaching. We want those authors to talk. And we actually, sometimes authors are shy about talking about their books, and we will actually encourage them to do so. So please don't be put off by, an author wants to talk about their book. No, Garth and I want authors to talk about their books. So let's be clear about that. And so I really appreciated that Pooja went over, for example, the 4 power tools. I'm not going to go over those with you here. I want that to be a prompt for you to listen and to enjoy that and to actually hear the author explain in her own terms. And so I think that's one of the benefits of listening to a podcast like this one. I really enjoyed the analogies. One of the running things you're going to hear. I was surprised to hear so much about the British baking shows and soggy messes And I enjoyed Nailed It or Not Sure. And I'm just going to let you enjoy that and listen for that. Of course, I totally agree with Pooja when she talks about exams and assessment, in that the first time a student is retrieving an item from their memory should not be on a midterm or a final. And I would just say amen to that, of course. I appreciate that Pooja is a wide reader and she's thinking deeply and reflecting a lot about her courses. She mentioned the book On Course by James Lang and how she's been inspired by that. And so I think that's a really good sign for all of us. And James Lang writes frequently for the Chronicle of Higher Education. And so those are really good sources for all of us to be thinking about. Garth and Pooja did talk about the dreaded word coverage, although I understand how they mean it in that context. I just don't like the idea of covering, as in sometimes we literally cover things, as in we cover them up and students don't actually get to them, but I know how they meant it. And finally, I thought that they ended on something really important, and I want to repeat it here. Pooja is very gracious and very sharing and generous. She has a website called retrievalpractice.org. I think that's all one word, obviously. Retrievalpractice.org, where she sends a weekly update. It's meant to be read in 30 seconds or less, and she has a mailing list of over 15,000 individuals where she has research reports and downloadable guides available. And so we would encourage you to support that and to utilize that source if you think that would be valuable to you. So please enjoy episode number 90.
I am here with Pooja Agarwal from Berklee College of Music in Boston, Massachusetts.
Yep.
I did it right?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, I had to restart that one. But hey, welcome to Psych Sessions. I'm really excited to talk to you.
I am so thrilled.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is my first
ahead.
ACT.
Yeah.
And I have loved it.
Really? I was going to ask you the same thing.
Yes.
So.
No, absolutely. And it's I spent so much of my time in an R1 researchy world, and this is just so much fun. So I'm so thrilled to be talking with you more about teaching. And,
Where do you, I'm guessing you do a lot of speaking gigs right now.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you, what kinds of places are you, who are you talking to?
Teachers.
Teachers.
Yeah, teachers. I do a fair amount of workshops, presentations at the K-12 level and at higher ed. And it's fun in a lot of different ways. Of course, there are big differences. I like to think about, just like with teaching, I like to think about how much can I accomplish in a half-hour keynote? How much can I accomplish in a 2-day workshop, right? How much can I accomplish seeing my students 3 hours a week? And what do I want to do at that time? On top of thinking about that, I really like thinking about how teaching in K-12 and teaching in higher ed are much more similar than people think. And the challenges, the successes, the ideas, we're all teachers, but I worry that we've got like these weird silos between K-12 and higher ed, and I feel like I get to benefit from both worlds, but it's something I'm trying to think about of how can we bring those two worlds together.
Right.
Yeah.
And I should mention that, I mean, probably even without writing a great book, you probably would have keynoted a lot of talks in your career. But you did just put out a book called Powerful Teaching. Maybe can you just tell us a little bit about the book? Because I do want to make sure that people know that you wrote this book.
Yeah. So the book is called Powerful Teaching, Unleash the Science of Learning. And I co-wrote it with a friend, colleague of mine, Patrice Bain. She is a veteran 6th grade social studies teacher. She's taught 6th grade for about 25 years. And she and I have known each other for 15 years. Before grad school, we started doing research on taking lab principles of how learning and memory work and actually trying them in the real world. And we started in her classroom. I got to spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for an entire academic year just hanging out in the back of her classroom, seeing how she did things and how she already uses a lot of these memory-based principles. But then how can we include some of the research, like some of the scholarship of teaching and learning, in what she's already doing and demonstrating, do these lab principles work in her classroom in teaching. And so this book, Powerful Teaching, became this kind of culmination of our 15 years of research and teaching that we've spent together. And Patrice and I have both always felt strongly that there is research to confirm what we already do as teachers. There's research to inform what we do as teachers. And so Patrice and I are really excited for the opportunity to share a little bit of the research on the science of learning, but to make it super practical. So here's a little bit about the research. Now here's what it means when you see 180 students every day. Here's what it means when you have a mountain of grading, and how you can use these research principles to actually decrease grading and improve student learning.
So you, did you find her? Did she find you? How did that all work?
Oh.
I'm guessing this is where?
When I was at Washington University in St. Louis.
Okay.
And she recently retired. She was teaching at a public school district in Columbia, Illinois, which is like 45 minutes outside of St. Louis. So my mentor, Henry Roediger, Roddy at WashU, he and colleagues Mark McDaniel, Kathleen McDermott, had just received a grant from the Institute of Education Sciences, which is like the independent research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. So they just received this grant to do this research in classrooms, and around the same time that they were applying for the grant, I'm pausing in case you want to edit this out, but I feel like I don't know if I'm supposed to tell this story or not, but it's fine.
Come on.
Patrice and her husband were getting, no, let me tell it a different way. So one of the PIs, Mark McDaniel, had run into an old college friend of his, Stephen. And they hadn't seen each other in 20, 30 years. They decided, let's go catch up and go get dinner. So Mark and his college friend Stephen were having dinner, and Stephen was joined by Patrice, his wife. So the three of them are having a great time, reminiscing about college together. And Mark mentions at this dinner, hey, I just got this grant to do research in classrooms. And Patrice said, well, I'm a classroom teacher. And so they hit it off. Patrice and I hit it off. The rest is history. But it just started through this like weird college buddy hanging out, getting drinks at a restaurant.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a cool story. Now, this is not the only book that's come out of that institution, right?
Right. Yep. So Roddy Roediger, Mark McDaniel with Peter Brown wrote the book Make It Stick. So Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. And I love that book because it helps put our research into words for a public audience. Like my mother loves the book, and it's accessible. And it provides a nice overview of the research in our field of cognitive psychology for a broad audience. And so with Powerful Teaching, we're really aiming to take that research and apply it in the classroom. Make It Stick came out of our research at Washington University and a lot of research from colleagues, mentors in the field.
Right. So with Powerful Teaching, what you're aiming for is, and maybe I'll just tell you a story about something that I experienced this year. I was doing a pre-term workshop with some faculty at my institution, and I thought I would just put together a little bit of a quiz for them. Do we all know the difference between scholarly teaching, scholarship of teaching and learning, formative, summative assessment, these kinds of things, and some learning science things. And I realized that even though we are probably doing some of the things, not all of us know the language, or that there is a literature on these kinds of things.
Right.
Is that who your book's for? People who don't just maybe are teachers who are interested definitely in teaching and students, but haven't thought much about scholarly teaching? Or who is who does this help in particular? Because I'll find it interesting, I know that.
Yeah.
But I will read a lot of books on teaching and learning.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. I feel that it is written for teachers, which of course is very broad. I remember reading somewhere that if you imagine the audience for a book can't fit in a room, then it's too broad of an audience. And so teachers is way too broad of an audience, right? And to encompass teachers from K-12 and higher ed is even more broad. I like to think of it as kind of you can't you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? Our book is intended for people who are already excited about teaching, people who may or may not know everything about this research, but are interested in learning more about cognitive science, the research behind these teaching strategies. So it's not geared toward necessarily faculty who are reticent, faculty who are, let me think. It's geared toward teachers in a way to give them words to what they do, to validate what we do well as good teachers, and to share a bit of that research behind it. So I would say it's for all teachers, but again, I think it's for an audience of people who are already in that boat together.
Thinking about this stuff.
Yeah.
So are you hearing from like elementary school teachers now? And are they finding that this really connects? So is it broadly? I guess is the audience probably as broad as you would have hoped it would be?
So far, I think so. I'm really excited to be learning. You know, I get a lot of feedback from people who are reading the book, which is just so helpful. And something that Patrice and I were mindful of and struggling to figure out was we wanted to share this research, but we wanted to share her teaching strategies in K-12 and my teaching strategies in higher ed. And from the feedback we're receiving, teachers feel that it is applicable for both types of sort of teaching educational levels. Now, a point we make in Powerful Teaching is that these strategies work for all ages. We present some research on infants. We talk about research on college students and med students. And for us, learning is the same, regardless of the content area, the ages, the skill level. We all want to learn, and a large part of that is remembering. And so in Powerful Teaching, we talk about these 4 power tools or strategies. Would you like me to go into them?
Yeah,
okay.
I love it. Yeah.
So the first power tool is what we call retrieval practice, which is this idea of getting information out of our heads. And it's so at the Berklee College of Music, I teach musicians. They can't major in psychology; they can minor in it. But a simple example I use with them is that they have to practice their instrument. They can't cram the night before a gig and expect that they are going to know their stuff or expect that they're going to remember it. So they have to practice their instrument. And in my classroom, they have to practice their knowledge. I'm not just a teapot filling their teacup. Traditional lecturing, there are some benefits of that as well. But with retrieval, you're trying to help students think about what they know and to practice them. So one example that I like to give that you heard here at ACT is to ask a few different trivia questions. So we talked about the number of bones in the adult human body.
206.
There you go. Why do you think you remember it, Garth?
Well, I didn't know it ahead of time, but
Okay.
you did ask 3 times, I think,
did.
in the talk. Yeah.
And I asked yesterday afternoon, so it's been more than 24 hours. So that's retrieval. And the second power tool, it's spacing.
practice,
Yeah. So we just spaced practice. My guess is tomorrow you may remember 206. Maybe the listeners will remember 206. And so spacing is a way to actually use forgetting to our advantage. So you let things kind of simmer. They sort of fizzle out in your heads, but then when you retrieve in a spaced out over time, there's this added mental struggle or challenge. And a lot of this research shows that mental struggle and spacing things out boosts learning. And we often think about trivia facts, for instance, as, you know, you go to pub trivia and it's fun because you're drinking and hanging with friends, but it's fun to kind of test what you know. As soon as students and teachers walk into the classroom and you ask students to retrieve, there's just sort of this, wait, you want me to do what, right? And it's a bit of an odd shock factor. So we retrieve every day outside the classroom, but you walk in and I ask students write down 2 things you remember about neuroscience from last week. And they look at me like I'm crazy because it's not for an exam. I'm not grading it. With these power tools, it's taking what good teachers, great teachers already do, but being a little more intentional about it. So retrieval, of course, comes into play with math. You do practice problems all the time. That's part of how we learn math, how you learn to ride a bike or an instrument. The third power tool called interleaving is one of the ones that teachers can really spend a lot more time thinking about. So math, for example, students already do retrieval. They might already space things out. Interleaving is a strategy where you simply mix things up. So an example for make it stick is if you imagine a batter and a pitcher at a batting practice, and the batter knows that they're going to get 10 fastballs, 10 curveballs, and 10 changeups, which I think are slow balls. And the batter knows, all right, these first 10 are fastballs, so here's how I'm going to hit it. The next 10 are curveballs, and so here's how I'm going to hit it, and then the next 10 are these changeups. With interleaving, if you mix those up, then all of a sudden the batter now has to think on the fly, what is this ball that is coming at me at 90 miles an hour, and what do I do about it?
Right.
And so in some sense, it's a literal, the batter doesn't know what is coming at them. But in a figurative way, with interleaving, students can't just sort of plug and chug. They don't know that they're doing 10 addition, 10 subtraction, or like 10 derivative problems and 10 interval problems and 10 statistics problems. When you mix up similar things, then students have to discriminate, just like that batter has to discriminate between pitches.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a 7-year-old, and in second grade now, she, for better or worse, she gets worksheets, and I see them using interleaving.
Oh, good.
Which is pretty cool, actually. So, and sometimes it catches me because I'm not paying careful enough attention when I'm looking at her work, and it goes from addition to subtraction, right? And but it's teaching her that you really need to pay attention and not just go on automatic. I know we haven't gotten to the fourth power tool yet, but what I really appreciated about your talk was how you have made this really accessible.
Oh, thanks.
For folks, and you've said you've really valued that people are already teaching well, but they can just use these power tools. They can use them to just not only to teach better, but to and for me, I think this is important. There's a time in my career where I just when I thought about my teaching and reflected on it, I was thinking to myself, I don't know that I'm doing responsible teaching here. I think what we do is we rely on maybe models for those of us who were never trained to teach, we just rely on models that we've seen. Right. Things that occur might be the best things for us to do.
Well, like in Lindsay Maslin's talk about how do you know that something works, and it's like, because it works for me.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yep.
It works for someone else, and then maybe there's data evidence in there.
And
right?
that's how we
teach.
If we don't have the training, that's how we teach.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is, I think, so valuable. At some point in my career, it was really valuable for me to know that, and it gave me confidence in the classroom that I'm teaching with the backing of what we know works as far as student learning goes. So anyway, I just wanted to say thanks for the way that you have presented that. It's very, very helpful, I think, to most teachers.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So something I was frankly nervous about giving this keynote at ACT is that I talk with a lot of teachers about teaching, and I have a research background in psychology, but this has been my first opportunity to talk with teachers of psychology. And so I had a hard time, or it was challenging for me to think about, well, how much research should I present? Because we're all psychologists, and so don't people want to know about the research? And I ultimately decided I have a half an hour. Screw it, we're teachers. I'm just going to focus on here tiny things you can do instead of the research. And so in some ways it was nice to just acknowledge with other psychology people in the room, look, there's all this research. And now I just want to talk about what this means when you have 80 or 100 students or 500 students in large lecture classes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I really appreciated that as well, because you really wanted to get to what does this mean?
Yeah.
And that definitely came across. So fourth power tool.
Fourth power tool is what we call feedback-driven metacognition. And it's the interplay between the importance of retrieval, but providing feedback, and then metacognition, helping students reflect on their own learning and their own thinking. Again, we already as teachers give feedback. I think an aspect of that, though, is to provide more opportunities for that reflection. So one example I gave in my talk was that my students have these written quizzes, and next to each short answer question, I just have these 2 check boxes that they check mark. And one of them says nailed it, and the other one says not sure. Have you seen the Netflix show Nailed It?
No.
This is a tangent. It's a fantastic show.
Okay.
And actually it plays into it, but that's why I came up with the phrase
Hold on,
nailed
what's the
it.
premise?
So it's a baking show. I do not bake. I hate to bake. I'm a scientist, and I love detailed data and following things in a structured way. But I throw things into a pot when I'm at home. So I don't like baking shows. But Nailed It is a show where they celebrate mistakes in a very literal way. So they bring in amateur home bakers who make brownies out of a box, and who maybe dabble in some other baking. They bring these 3 amateur bakers in. They give them the most elaborate things to bake, like a 5-story Hogwarts Harry Potter cake. And they give them an hour and a half to do this. And so it's just these 3 amateur bakers frantically running around trying to do the best they can. And at the end of, it's like a 20-minute episode, but there are 3 challenges, I think. And at the end of every challenge, they have one of those bell jar things that you put over a plate. I don't know what they're called.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Like at a hotel or something.
Yes, yeah.
All right.
And so they cover up their creation, and the judges call on each one, and they lift this thing up and they go, nailed it. And it's like the most horrible, mushy mess that does not resemble the Hogwarts cake at all. But you're laughing with the bakers. You're not laughing at them. And there's some way that they create this atmosphere in this show where like everyone's in on it, and it's totally okay to make mistakes. And so I've seen the Great British Baking Show, but watching Nailed It was the first time I was like, oh, I could totally screw up at baking, and that would be fun to see how much I screw up.
Right.
And so in some ways it played into how I approached like the Nailed It, not sure with this power tool, but then retrieval and being comfortable in learning from your mistakes.
Yeah.
But then being aware that it's okay to make mistakes. It's fun to test yourself. You get some feedback. Maybe sometimes the bakers will put salt in the cake instead of sugar or something.
They're that amateur.
Oh yes. Oh yes. You will have to see this.
Oh, okay. So these are not people like I enjoy being in the kitchen, but I don't like baking, but I get it. And this is not them.
No. This is like
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So hold on. We got to talk about this a
Okay.
little bit
I'd
more.
rather talk about this anyway.
So this actually reminds me of teaching in some ways, because I think when you get a new course handed to you, sometimes you have an hour and a half. It feels like you have an hour and a half to create the Hogwarts whatever.
Yes.
Right?
I didn't think about it that way.
And then you have to, except it's not as funny because you're dealing with students like learning. But I think
you don't want to screw it up that much.
Well, and I think early on in your career, there's probably a lot more pressure as well.
Yeah.
But there is something there. Like, can we have fun? I'm thinking about this a lot because I've been teaching for a while now, but this the person who was going to teach biopsych for us could not teach it. Got another job, which was great for her. But she was going to teach biopsych, and I have no business teaching biopsych. And 2 weeks before the term started, my dean said, hey, do you want to teach this? And I knew that if I didn't, then it would get canceled.
Oh.
And
how many students had enrolled?
Well, not that many,
Not
but
that
we don't.
matters,
it was
but-
it was 25.
That's still
But yeah, so and it was 2 weeks before the term, and so it
Right.
wasn't really that fair. And I thought, I'm gonna nail it.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm doing a little better than a soggy mess right now. But it is, it's interesting to think about, and I think the important thing to remember is that it's got to be a fun process.
Yeah.
Early on in my career, when I was talking to somebody else about this today, when I didn't have control or when I didn't know what I was doing in a class like this, I would try to like overly compensate to my students, so I would be really rigid about things, and so and
like
other people
assignments and grading or lessons and lectures. Okay,
everything. I
Yeah.
mean, just trying to just tighten things up and do it perfectly.
Yeah.
Instead of just taking a breath, and I think you maybe just learn that over time.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Can I?
Yeah. Go
well,
ahead.
If I can give you an example, and this happened in the past 2-3 days I've been here at ACT. ACT.
I don't know. I call it ACT, but they call it ACT.
I don't know. I like the verb of like act as, it's a verb. But anyway, in the past 2 days, students in my intro psych classes have to make these short videos. They read a research article, but then they have to explain it and communicate the science in everyday language. They have to talk about why they picked the article, why people should care, and then we watch the videos in class, but then they also put them on their YouTube channels and get like hundreds of hits. And so they've got this video project, and they're small weekly assignments throughout the semester, and they just did their dress rehearsal. So they're musicians, and so, we do a lot of musical analogies. So they just did their dress rehearsal for their video, and I have not had the chance to give them feedback. And I use this tech tool called Flipgrid that I mentioned. It's super fast. I just have not had the chance. So I decided, I emailed them like an hour ago and said, look, I'm extending the deadline by 2 weeks. I sincerely apologize that I've not gotten you feedback. And I was talking with someone else at ACT about this. When I see my students on Tuesday, today is Saturday. Yeah, okay. When I see my students on Tuesday, and I've done this a few times, I'm going to put up a slide with photos of what I have been doing as a way of saying, it's kind of a soggy mess right now, but here's what I've been up to. I've been traveling for 3 weeks straight. So I was in St. Louis visiting friends and family. I was in Seattle last weekend.
Oh, you were?
Yeah, visiting friends, and I gave a talk at a K-12 conference. Okay. And now here I am at ACT. And so I want to show them that, teachers are people, and this is what I've been up to, but then I want to have a slide of here's what I've also learned from the past 3 weeks. And so I hope that by bringing students into the soggy mess and acknowledging that these things happen in the classroom might help take that intimidation, we shall create the perfect baking dish in our teaching, into helping students understand that we kind of delay, screw things up, and they do, and it's a give and take.
It's interesting because it's a privileged position in your career to be able to be that transparent with students, right?
Yeah.
Because if I'm on the tenure track or something like that, I don't want that kind of stuff to show up in my evaluation like this. You know what I'm saying? But and that's what I've learned now that I kind of am further along in my career. And that I had no idea about before.
Well, and I'm an assistant professor. We're unionized at Berklee, so there's a promotion process, but there's no tenure. I'm very fortunate to be there. There's a whole lot of autonomy that I recognize, so I can play around with my teaching methods a bit more. But at the same time, I think it comes back to what is the purpose of learning and what is our purpose as teachers. And is it to just fill students' heads with knowledge and let them move on and they forget everything? I think a core component of teaching is building relationships with students. And for me, frankly, if I'm at an institution that doesn't value that, then I'm going to really have a hard time with that. So if I can be transparent with my students, and it reflects in the course evals, for instance, and it reflects in their long-term learning, I think it all plays into each other.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting to me that if you go back on Tuesday and show that slide of what you've been doing and the fact that you're reflecting on it, we can go back to your fourth tool, which is that metacognitive piece, right?
Yep.
Where you're modeling for them that I have been reflecting on what the things that I have been learning, and hopefully they see that, right? And you're So tell us about the fourth tool.
Oh, well, that's the gist, right?
Okay.
So it's giving feedback to students, but then helping them with this metacognition. So I have these check boxes, and students check box, nailed it or not sure. And I don't use these check boxes for a grade. It's just so that when I do very quickly grade these written quizzes, when I hand them back, it's a future note to themselves. So I thought I nailed it, but, I totally misunderstood the question or the concept. Or I had checkboxed, I wasn't sure, but now that I've got my written quiz back, I see that, I totally actually got the question correct. And that helps. There's research on this in cognitive psychology where there's a disconnect between our accuracy and our confidence, right? We see this in the classroom. Students cram for a test. They think they know it all. They bomb it. And then they're like, but I studied for 6 hours straight, Yep. And so retrieval helps fix that disconnect, and then feedback helps fix that disconnect. So one example we give in Powerful Teaching is we ask readers, what is the capital of Australia? Do you know what the capital of Australia is? You travel a lot.
I'm going to say Perth.
Perth.
Is it?
Why do you think it's Perth?
Because I think I remember it's not Sydney.
Okay.
And so I'm just guessing.
Yeah. So you just retrieved, right?
Okay,
First of all.
Yeah. Did I retrieve correctly?
You keep
okay.
at,
All right, let's keep
right?
going.
But students
Come on.
want no.
Yeah.
This is great because students immediately want the answer,
Yeah.
and now I'm making you struggle with it, right? How confident do you think you are on a scale of 1 to 4? 4 being totally sure it's Perth, 1 being 100% guess.
Now I'm thinking about Adelaide and Brisbane, and I think I'm 70%. I think I'm 50% sure. I think I'm 50%
You went from
sure.
70% to 50%.
It's pretty close. Yeah, I think
Okay,
I'm.
so you're like half.
But
sure?
there is this. We're also being recorded, so this might be a different conversation. I may be more confident if we weren't being recorded right now. So, but let's go 50%. I'm 50% confident.
So now, are you ready for the answer?
Yeah.
And yeah. So the answer is Canberra.
Oh my god!
It's not Sydney. It's not Melbourne. So you remembered correctly that it's not Sydney.
Yeah.
Now, often when I ask this question when I'm speaking with teachers or anyone, so many people think it's Sydney. And at some point you learn that it's not. But people are convinced it has to be Sydney,
Right.
or they're convinced it has to be Melbourne. And so there's this aha moment of actually it's neither, it's Canberra. And it's this interplay again between confidence and accuracy. When we're highly confident in something and we get it wrong, it's what we call a hypercorrection effect. Now you are much more likely to remember it's Canberra because of that shock factor. So again, that's where this fourth power tool, feedback, plays into metacognition plays into feedback, so that students better understand, let's say before they go into an exam, as Patrice likes to put it, students know what they know, and they know what they don't know, so that they're not walking into an exam with this false illusion of confidence or fluency. They know how ready they are, they know how much they're prepared, they have a better sense of their own knowledge.
So how do you, in your teaching, how do you get students to know what they know and know what they don't know? Yeah, how do you work this out with your students? Is it just through practice?
It's practice. And so with retrieval practice, and this was actually one of the things I was thinking about the keynote yesterday, and I kept thinking, man, there's so much I wanted to say that I couldn't say. So this was one of the things, is that in exams and assessment have a purpose. We want to know if students learned stuff, right? And I sort of oversimplified and emphasized that why do we have midterms and finals? Can't it be a weekly quiz instead? An aspect of that, and then getting to this metacognition in my classroom, I believe that the first time a student retrieves should not be on a midterm or a final. That is the wrong time to retrieve for the very first time, right? And so if students are retrieving along the way, they become more comfortable with their metacognition. They become more aware of, oh, Pooja asked me about classical conditioning. We talked about it 3 weeks ago. Oh, crap, I forgot it. But now they get feedback and they know that they will learn it better. They can reflect on why they forgot it. We can come up with more examples. So it's through that retrieval process that metacognition kind of comes along the way. But I like having explicit conversations with students. So one of the things that's included in Powerful Teaching are a few sort of discussion prompts Patrice and I use. So one of them is I ask my students, how do you study? Why do you study this way? And does it work? And the third one I love, because students will kind of look at me and they'll shrug.
I've never thought about it.
Right. I've never thought about it. And I often get the kinda question mark.
Yeah.
And it's like they recognize that they do well if they cram, but then they forget it all. And that's another way of helping students reflect on their learning is, well, how do you study? And how do you learn? And how do you forget?
It's unbelievable that such a simple question could possibly have a super profound effect on a student because they've never thought about it before.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. No, it's really, really good. Okay, so do you put these check boxes on what kind of assignments are these? Are they just short answer written assignments?
Yeah, so I have kind of... I'll talk about the basic course design.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is...
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so the basic course design, at least for my intro psych class, I also teach cognitive psych. For my intro psych classes, I kind of have 4 categories. So one are these weekly retrieval practices. They're short answer mini quizzes, front to back, so 2 pages, I guess, and I maybe have 4 or 5 questions on them. And they range from, what's the difference, or I recently asked this question, what are the 2 signals of sorts that are in the brain and neurons, electrical and chemical, and we've talked about this, and I have them draw a neuron, and they all failed miserably. And then we talked about, well, why was that hard, or, that's an opportunity for feedback. Anyway, so I've got more kind of basic questions, but I never ask students for definitions. Instead, I'll say something like, we talked about classical conditioning 3 weeks ago, give me an example from your own life. Mm-hmm. So they don't have to define it, but they have to understand the concept. Then sometimes I ask questions, or oftentimes, that have no right or wrong answer at all. So early on in the semester, I asked students, are all humans scientists? And with these questions, these kind of front and back retrievals, I dedicate about 20 to 25 minutes out of my 3 hours each week to silent writing time. These are all closed book. And then that's about 25 minutes. And then we have about 25 minutes of discussion. So getting back to the categories, that's one of them. They're weekly. We have a 15-week semester. They have 14 retrieval practices because we don't the first week.
Okay, I'm going to stop you
sure.
because I have questions about it.
Yeah.
So 3 hours, how is that divided up in a week? One block?
It depends on the semester. So currently this fall semester, I meet with students 2 hours on Tuesdays, 1 hour on Thursdays.
Whoa.
But then sometimes it's a 3-hour block once a week.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and you are spending 25 minutes. They get this 2-page worksheet essentially with some questions on it, and it's closed book, and they're just going
they're
for
retrieving.
it. They're retrieving.
Yeah.
And each of those questions, after they draw the neuron, there's a checkbox where they have to put nail in it.
Yeah. Oh, and then sometimes I have students who will
awesome.
draw their own checkbox, and they'll be like, absolutely no idea. And they'll checkbox their little, like, drawn-in checkbox. And it reminds me, so every retrieval, one of these weekly retrieval practices, I always have an optional question. So I didn't get to this, but I love them. I have a whole list in the book. I call them retrieval warmups when I talk to teachers about it. My students think they're just optional questions, but for me it's a way of normalizing of sorts that we retrieve in everyday life. So one of my favorites, or we did mention it, or it was mentioned briefly, is what's your least favorite ice cream flavor? And Garth, you had said it's anything fruit flavored.
Yeah. That's a waste, right? You need cookie dough or, I don't know, caramel.
And you remember my least favorite.
Mint chocolate chip.
Okay, great. So spacing retrieval.
Yeah.
Another one my students like is, would you rather own a sailboat or a hot air balloon?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
A sailboat.
Why?
I don't want to die.
You're from Seattle.
I don't want to die in a hot air balloon.
Why not?
Because it sounds terrible. Like, I think it's like availability.
Drown.
Yeah, I don't know. And water's terrifying as well. But no, I think hot air balloon. Yeah, it's my mind is going to dark places right now.
Okay.
So
See, I would choose hot air balloon, hands down.
Just for the views.
Yeah,
it's got a lot.
I'm from the Midwest,
Okay.
and so I love seeing. And, people in the Midwest are like, cornfields are so boring. I think it's majestic. So with a hot air balloon, being able to see hundreds of miles around me would be so cool.
I got it.
But see, so you and I have stories behind ice cream. We have stories and are retrieving sailboats and hot air balloons and our experiences and our expectations. So with these optional questions, my students will sometimes draw in, again, their own checkboxes with, like, absolutely I hate Rocky Road. And they'll checkbox nailed it.
Oh, really?
And I've had students say, well, why don't you put the checkboxes next to the optional one? I'm like, well, I don't know. I guess I could.
So are the optional questions just engaging questions?
Yes.
Just to get them to... They're fun?
Yeah. And then that's how we start the next 25 minutes of discussion, is with the optional question first.
Okay.
And so recently I asked, would you rather get locked out of your car or your house? What's your favorite word in the English language? I don't know if you're thinking of any of these, but...
No, I'm just thinking about why you do this, and I get that it loosens students up. It creates a more dynamic and active kind of or group discussion that they're interested in engaging in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, that's awesome.
Yeah,
it's a cool idea.
And it's so the retrieval, right? When we're in a classroom, we associate retrieval with assessment. The only time students retrieve are oftentimes is a midterm and a final. And again, it's for me a way of showing, either implicitly or explicitly, we retrieve all the time. I mean, we have to retrieve what time we need to be at school. We have to retrieve where that coffee shop is. We have to retrieve what time I'm meeting people for dinner tonight. That's all retrieval. And students can then share their stories as a way of,
Yeah, so, and then you are reflecting back to them, this is retrieval.
Sometimes I say that, but sometimes I enjoy letting them figure that out.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you give them in a 15-week semester, you give them 14 of these assignments. So that's a major piece of this.
Well, so I dropped the lowest 4.
Yep.
Because then it makes an even 10.
Are you grading all these?
It takes me a minute or less per student.
A minute per or less per student per assignment?
Per one of these weekly retrieval practices. So with 80 students, it takes me less than 2 hours to grade them, put the scores into Moodle. And so with the taking, right, so 14, I dropped 4, so they're 10, and they're 10 points each out of 400 points. So they're worth 2% of students' grades each week.
So 2 hours a week you're spending that's grading these assignments.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that's not much.
No. Okay, so that's one of the things that you do in your course.
Yeah. So of the 4 categories, so they're each 100 points. And this was based on a book that I read a long time ago, and I still read, by James Lang, who's written a number of fantastic books. And this earlier book of his called On Course really helped me think through this point system and the grading. And so I've got these 4 categories, 100 points each. So 1 are the weekly retrievals, but then when you break it down, they're 2% each. 1 are these weekly video projects I mentioned, and because they're spread out over time, they're also low stakes. So those maybe are from 2 to 6% of students' grades, but adding up to a quarter. The 3rd category is group projects, and I like to tell my students from day one that group projects can suck, and I try my best to make them not suck. And I do that in 2 ways. We do all the group project stuff in class. They never have to meet outside of class. And students' grades are not dependent on their group. So if there's someone slacking off, it will not bring their grade down. Now, the group projects, actually, I've been wanting to write about this somewhere, but and these are musicians, but I have them design and carry out an experiment and present it. They can't major in psych. We don't go through hard-hitting research methods. But I do feel, and a lot of us feel this way, psychology is a part of everyday life. So, I'll tell my students, come up with an experiment about choking under pressure or test anxiety. And so recently I had some students come up with an experiment where they wanted to see if other Berklee students would perform better or worse if they're performing in front of strangers, friends, or professors. Which one would they, when they collect data, in which situation are students going to perform the best? And so in these group projects, they design it all in class. We spend time going through their data, and so they don't have to meet outside of class. Now, what's fascinating to me is sometimes the groups decide themselves to meet outside of class because they want to run and collect data all together. And I'm like, kudos to you. You really don't have to, but they'll meet outside of class of their own volition.
So they're actually doing the research?
Yeah.
They're going to observe what happens?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Do you run that? Do you have to run that through anything, or can you just do it? Okay. Yeah.
I mean, because it's for educational benefit.
Yep.
We're not publishing the data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So who do they perform? I'm going to guess they perform best in front of professors.
Oh, I don't know. They just decide. They're doing it right now.
Oh, they are? Okay.
So we don't know yet. But it's cool, right? Because a lot of psychology research is done with so-called weird samples, and how often is psychology research done specifically with musicians? So they can take research questions that have been well identified, like they're learning about invisible gorilla and inattentional blindness, but then they can come up with experiments more related to music. So what might inattentional blindness look like, or change blindness, for instance? Can musicians recognize changes in music or not, in the same way that we can't recognize changes in landscapes or houses, or I've got all kinds of fun YouTube videos. So these group projects, they make them relatable to their own lives, but also to music. So it's a nice spin for me as a psychology professor. I'm not a musician, but then I get to learn about how they think about the world, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So that's the third category. And then the fourth one's participation. Something very important to me is that students can participate outside of class, and they have a number of ways to do this. So 40% of my students are international and English language learners, and putting them on the spot is not something, putting any student on the spot is not something I want to do. So they can post, I use this Flipgrid, they can post extra videos, they can email me, they can come to office hours, they can talk to me before or after class, so they don't have to just participate in class. And again, I grade it on a weekly basis, so each week it's 2% of their grade. So a number of my students have gigs, and they travel the world, and they miss weeks during the semester. And because all of my assignments are low stakes spread out throughout the semester, if they're absent once or twice or a few times, it's no big deal for their grade, as opposed to bombing an exam and freaking out about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's cool. I love hearing about how people structure their intro psych course because it's such a beast. There's so much to cover, which Eric, my co-host, hates that word, coverage. But there's so much material,
There
and you
is.
Do you cut a lot of material?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Me
And
too.
again, I have the autonomy to do that. I don't use a textbook. So with these groups, over the course of the semester, each of my classes are capped at like 25 students. So let's say, and that adds an element of what I can do different from a large lecture class, but I still think some of these strategies could work for large classes. So let's say a class of 20 students, I split them up into 4 groups, so 5 students each group, but it depends on the class size. So of the 4 groups, each group reads a different book. So one group reads, currently these are the books I use. I've changed them over time. One group reads Choke, What the Secrets of the Brain Reveal About Something by Sion Bylock. And of course for musicians, learning about anxiety and stress and choking under pressure is great. Another book is The Invisible Gorilla Book. The third book is Make It Stick by Peter Brown and Roddy and Mark McDaniel. And the fourth one is Scent, The Scent of Desire by Rachel Hers. And all 4 of those books are written by psychological scientists. They're all written for a broad audience. So what we get to do every class, especially for the 3-hour blocks, I don't have the patience to spend 3 hours just talking about language and 3 hours just talking about neuroscience and 3 hours just talking about sleep, with how textbooks are structured. So this way, by the end of the semester, students have read 1 book, but they feel like they've read all 4. And every book hits on key psychology topics. So in the context of scent, we can talk about classical conditioning. We like smells because we associate them. We have memories about them. Invisible Gorilla, we can talk about judgment and decision-making and heuristics. In scent, we can talk about learning and memory. In choking under pressure, we can talk about emotion and stress. So in that way, I get to cover, not to use the word Eric doesn't like, I get to share, to discuss with students a lot of key topics in psychology without that rigid structure of a textbook. And so I love the way Lindsay Maslin was saying, why do we start our teaching with the materials as opposed to starting to teach and course design in a different way about what our dependent variable is of learning. Yeah. Yeah.
So the students share out what they're reading with the rest of the class, and then you use that as opportunities to really pull out the psychology, the concepts that they need to know, and then you are testing them on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these retrieval practice, what do you call them? Do you call them
I call them
tests?
retrieval practices. So I never use the word test.
Okay.
Ever.
Okay.
It's not on my syllabus. I have this website, retrievalpractice.org. It's not in there. I think in the entire Powerful Teaching book, I maybe use the word test twice.
Yeah.
Because I like to decouple retrieval from assessment. And scientifically, we for a long time referred to this as the testing effect. Tests help boost learning. So you'll see headlines, we need to test our students more and not less. I think that gives the wrong impression, and it makes for nice headlines. Like we need to test more.
Yeah.
Testing is good.
Yeah.
Instead
Retrieval's
of
good.
Right, retrieval's good. And my colleague Jeff Karpicki has made this point: is that it's not the test that improves learning. It can be flashcards. It can be telling stories. It's just the retrieval, not the test itself. So I don't use the word test at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these retrieval opportunities that you have, they are not going to all be they're going to be mixed, right? Are they going to pull from a lot of different areas of psychology based on what those chapters were that students were reading that week?
Yeah, so every written retrieval includes at least one question about the specific book. So like the back page always says, here are 4 questions. 1 for choke, 1 for invisible gorilla, 1 for make it stick, 1 for scent. Answer the question for your book. And then again, we can discuss all 4 books, like what was in chapter 4 for all 4 books, and we can talk about that and relate it to everyday life.
So it seems to me like you have gone with the strategy, now you can tell me if I'm wrong, of how many questions are there on your, you said 4 to 5 questions on, okay. So you've gone with the strategy of picking about 60 to 75 kind of concepts to understand in the course.
Sure.
And I'll tell you why I like that, because I don't know how many concepts a regular like psychology textbook has in it, but it's probably double or triple that.
Yeah.
And none of us can do that well.
No.
And I think that those of us who have the freedom and the autonomy to do what you're doing, this is actually what we want to do.
Right.
We want to, and
even people who don't, teachers who may have less freedom and less autonomy, I think also want to do this.
And what do we want? We actually just want to give students the right amount of material that they can actually learn instead of overwhelming them with,
key facts and
totally
bolded words and textbooks. And another thing I like about this approach is that humans are messy. Humans are complex. That's why I think a lot of us enjoy teaching psychology and thinking about psychology. And so in this way, with going with these 4 different groups, I mean, it makes no sense. Like chapter 4 in scent is about aromatherapy, let's say, and chapter 4 in choke is about working memory. They may not seem related, but it's it's a far richer, it's a more rich discussion about all the complexities of humans.
Yeah.
And I think that's just so much more fun to reflect on and think about too.
And there's probably a lot more integration than we think. Once they start talking about it, you can probably say, there's learning in all these 3 things. Let's talk about learning theory.
Yeah.
Well, hey, we both have dinners to get to, and it has been a long weekend. So thanks for doing this.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for coming to ACT and giving this keynote, and I hope your book is doing really well. I know that I see it all around, so people are reading it and loving it, and I really do love what you're doing, and it's so nice to hear what you're doing in your intro class in particular.
I love talking about it,
Yeah,
it's so much fun. Can I share something in case listeners would like more resources?
Please,
so, of course, there's the book we mentioned.
Yeah.
It's on Amazon, but I do spend some time, we all have a limited amount of time, on this website, retrievalpractice.org, where I send out these weekly email updates of sorts that are meant to be read in 30 seconds or less. It's like, here's one teaching tip, here's a cool resource, here's a podcast like Psych Sessions that I really like, and you can read it, you can click on one button, and you can get a teaching tip and move on with your day. So I send those to 15,000 people, and I like sharing cool things about teaching. And so I hope that I would love to have more psychology people as a part of that, because I'm teaching psychology to teachers, right? And I think the more we can get teachers of psychology involved in the teaching of psychology to teachers, right, to be very meta, is a lot of fun. So I've got research reports and downloadable guides and discussion questions, activities for students at retrievalpractice.org.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, everybody go check out retrievalpractice.org and check out Powerful Teaching. And Pooja, thanks again.
Thank you, Garth.